in January of 2022 with the Hungaha'apai eruption, which is north of New Zealand, the Kermadec Trench and Tonga, the biggest volcanic eruption in the 21st century. There was a global electromagnetic impulse that occurred in the Schumann resonances. So the entire planet for about 2 hours had an increase in those frequencies globally. And some of the research for that came out of Hungary, which is very far away from New Zealand, but they registered the spike in that frequency range from 0 to 40 hertz in the magnetic field and also the electric field. So, they're connected to really big volcanic eruptions. We see how they change during geomagnetic storms and from the solar cycle, which is 12 years long, potentially from longer rhythms of solar activity like Gleisberg cycles, 88 years. There's, also even longer than that. Solar flare impacts, they charge the ionosphere. That will alter the Schumann resonances on the daylight side that's receiving that solar flare. And so they just have this interesting connection to everything. This energy field that's just always resonating, always exists. It's electromagnetic energy, so it's light energy, pulsing 8 times a second, 14 times a second, connecting all of us together. Really, they make up Earth's brainwaves. They connect to our heart rhythms. They could be a candidate for at least part of a collective consciousness, because any energy field is also an information field. So if we're all, working with them and connected to them in terms of our brain activity and our thoughts, and that is perhaps we're receiving downloads from them, but also, putting uploads into them, they could explain a lot of things. So they're a perfect candidate for explaining a lot of these psychic or spiritual phenomena that we're trying to understand. We know they exist, but we're still trying to come to a, let's say, more scientific understanding. Not that we need to, but they're there. The understanding's there at the Schumann resonances. So they're wild. And that's what got me into it. That was back in, suppose 2020, 2021, right when there was some really big astrological cycles taking place.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I couldn't help but sort of just perk up around when the student's ready, the teacher kind of appears. It's I'm just picturing you as the geophysicist just hanging out, just measuring some stuff, and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, just ignore that. And you're like, ignore what? Wait, what?
Yeah.
And it's like, that's fascinating. I want to know more about that. The thing that some of these things hidden in plain sight, right? Until, when the student's ready, the teacher appears. Also, can you explain to us the person that sort of came up with it? Because I've never really, I hadn't. I'm an engineer, but I never really came to this awareness that there's these two parts of our atmosphere, and there's waves sort of happening in between there, and then also that a lot of what carries charge in our atmosphere is actually water. That entire thing was also very important for me to start to wrap my head around as I was embracing your work. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the guy who theorized them was a German chap, and I don't know all of his work. He's most well known for the Schumann resonances. His name is Winfried Otto Schumann, and he was getting further along in his career when he theorized them. And there is some talk, maybe some evidence that Tesla had kind of theorized these things as well. But that research or just data publication, whatever, isn't readily out there, so we don't exactly know. Of course, a lot of his files were taken upon his death, so maybe it was in there. Regardless, the first real public info on the Schumann resonances was put out in 1952 by Winfried Otto Schumann. Basically, he was an atmospheric physicist, and he said, hey, if we have this ionosphere up above us, and we know that there's certain oscillation frequencies of plasma, and plasma, because of this natural oscillation that it has, only frequencies that are higher than it can emit from the plasma. And so plasma generates a whole bunch of frequencies because it's naturally resonating. And there's also different coherency domains within, let's say, a plasmoid or a plasma. And so those that are lower frequency than the natural plasma frequency will stay within the plasmoid, but the higher frequency ones can pass through it. And so, like, for example, radio frequency communication, you need a high enough frequency to cut through the lower part of the ionosphere, the D region or the E region, to then bounce off the F region. And so now you're using megahertz radio waves. If you use lower frequency, then you'll bounce off the D region or the E region, D region being 50 kilometers up on the day side, goes away at night, the E region being about 100 kilometers up, and maybe 120 kilometers up. That stays there day or night, though it decharges at night because you don't have active sunlight coming in. But he's like, hey, like if lightning is producing all this energy across the entire light spectrum, and we know we have the ionosphere and how some waves bounce off of it, we should have the lowest frequency waves, which don't get absorbed easily into things because they have such a low frequency. Every cycle is an opportunity to interact with something at an atomic level, or you could even say at a quanta level, right? Quanta just meaning the smallest observable thing in that system. Quanta of light is a photon. So at the quantum level, every cycle, every waveform is an opportunity of interaction. Well, if you're only cycling 8 times a second, that's way less opportunities to get absorbed into something than if you're cycling 1,000,000 times per second. So he was like, we should be having these extremely low frequency waves bounce off the ionosphere. They're constantly being produced from lightning strikes, and they should form standing waves. And he calculated that waveguide created from the ground surface and the ionosphere, both of them being conductive, about 7 orders of magnitude more conductive than the atmosphere in between, which is very resistive, 10 to negative 14, allowing these magnetic fields to cut through it very easily. If it was conductive, the atmosphere, a magnetic field would get absorbed into it, but because it's resistive, magnetic field isn't absorbed into it easily. So they're able to just propagate through this waveguide. He calculated the Egan frequencies that they're called. He was slightly off with his calculations for a variety of reasons, but just a few years later, they actually observed them. He was fairly close. But they observed them. They're like, hey, these Schumann resonances that you theorize exist. And within just like 10 to 15 years, scientists are already starting to play with them as it relates to brain waves and heart rhythms and like psychedelic experiences. There's some work from the 70s that you have to take with a grain of salt, but this guy supposedly, I think his name was like Ken Beck, that might be his name. He built a massive Schumann coil. And he had someone like lay down on it, he flipped it on, and supposedly within seconds, it triggered like LSD-like symptoms. And so they stopped doing the experiments afterwards because it was like too crazy. But that was like, I think 1973 or 1972, and they were first observed in the late 50s. So like, we already had all this information on brainwaves, the frequency structure of that, because brainwaves are observed, I think in the 10s or the 20s, like 1920 at the latest. And so all of a sudden, when they observed the frequency range of the Schumann resonances were the same, and also had the same intensity magnetic field with picotesla strength or microvolt strength for the electric field, they're like, they probably have an overlap. And people were pretty open to these things back in the 60s and the 70s. In 1965, you just had a Pluto-Uranus conjunction, sextile Neptune. All the hippies were running around, God bless them. And so people were open to this stuff. But since then, it's kind of gone quiet, you could say, and there's more and more people coming into awareness of them, becoming interested in them. And I think this century, our understanding of them is just going to completely blow our minds. And I think we'll start to tap into them in incredible ways, especially as it relates to the more consciousness aspect to them.
Hey there, Inspired Evolutionary. If you absolutely love this, well then here's a full conversation with this guest on the Inspired Evolution podcast. Check it out now.